Beautiful, beautiful that that's in the Talmud. Amazing to me.
Yeah, and that's why recovering all of this in mainstream cannabis culture helps significantly with detaching the bias for the very reason that you just
Right,
gave, right? Like
right.
this isn't Scientology. We're talking about like the oldest tradition in the world. And so it gives people a whole other perspective, tradition, and worldview.
Welcome to Season 5 of the Cannabis Truth Podcast. Your host is Honey Smith Walls, author of the new book, Healing Beyond High Cannabis Truth, a gentle, practical guide for elders to learn cannabis fundamentals safely and effectively without overuse or overwhelm. In a world where the FDA has yet to stamp its approval on this ancient natural remedy, Honey Smith Walls bridges the gap between Western healthcare norms, uplifting benefits and relief through gentle cannabis plant therapies. Join this 21st century cannabis shaman, uniquely positioned to assess the green intentions of medical, farming, and business industries in cannabis and uncover fascinating historical, political, scientific, and spiritual facets of the plant.
Okay. Well, can I just tell you a little secret, Lissa?
Yeah.
I've been upset with my podcasting platform for some time and meaning to switch over to Zoom, and you're my very first Zoom recording.
Oh, I'm so happy to hear that.
Me too. I appreciate your help with this and your patience in this little snag-a-foo. But thank you so much. I'm delighted that you're here. And I guess we'll just have to sort of begin again. But you are a goddess in my heart for all
Oh,
that you
thank you.
stand for, honestly, all that you do, what your mission is. And I cannot wait for my audience to hear you and understand what's happening in the world and how it affects all of us.
Yeah. Um, well, I'm not sure where you want me to begin. I loved your question about empathy.
So yeah,
Um,
what you had said, you made a little factoid. If you
well,
could
it's like
repeat
I think
that.
a lot of us go into the cannabis industry expecting the industry itself to reflect like higher values, right? And that everybody we meet is going to be like kind and trustworthy and like primarily concerned with healing people. But we know that's not the case, and that the same forms of like misinformation and implicit bias that create systemic inequalities in any company operating in late stage capitalism is also going to be present in the cannabis industry. So even though we all think of ourselves and try to be really empathetic, one thing I just learned in my research and also just doing this work as the editor in chief of Cannabis U magazine, which I founded as the first and only Jewish voice in the cannabis press, which covers the cannabis news from a Jewish perspective, is that empathy really requires that we think about the world from the position of someone else.
Yeah.
However, empathy is also foreclosed when we assimilate the position of someone very different from us to our own, right?
Mm,
So empathy really requires a recognition of the limits I have as the person I am, to know what it's like to be someone who's positioned in a very different way, right, in the world. So, for instance, um, this problem of like, how do I have empathy for someone whose experience is radically different from mine,
right.
especially when I lack access to that
Mhm,
experience precisely
mhm,
because it's so different, has
mhm.
led a lot of Black scholars who work in critical race theory to conclude that white people are actually impaired in their empathic ability for Black people because they tend not to recognize the limits of their ability as white people to understand the experience of being Black. But we
Isn't
can
it? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
But we can see the same thing with respect to gender, right? Like a lot of men don't recognize the limits of their ability to understand what it's like to be a woman, right? And to live in the world as a woman. And we often wish that men would just take a minute, like, and realize the limits of their ability to understand exactly what we're going through, right? And so my role right now, especially, and what I've been writing about is just a way of conveying to people in the cannabis industry in particular why we can't close the Jewish experience of the world or reduce the Jewish experience of the world to the white experience of the world. And when we do, we put ourselves like in a position we are incapable of empathizing with Jewish pain right now because we've actually disavowed their Jewish ancestry and Jewish ethnicity, right, to an understanding of who we are and where we stand with respect, right, in the
Yeah.
world, and sort of the what we suffer from that other people don't.
Yeah.
But
It's
like
okay to.
recognize, yeah, but recognizing the specificity of the Jewish experience is also really connected to everything I'm doing with Cannabis Jew magazine, because there's a really unique relation that Jews have to cannabis and a unique role that it has always played from really the ancient world, right, in Jewish culture and in spiritual traditions, precisely because we're not Christian and precisely because the Jewish tradition departs so radically from the Greco-Roman tradition. And
Yeah.
so I started this whole thing when I had my own like midlife Jewish woman magic and was like, I can't do academia anymore. Like I'm exhausted and it just felt useless to me on like so many levels, like so
Mhm.
many levels. But what I loved about academia was like the Jewish educational outreach to largely like white communities that had absolutely no idea how to start thinking about Jews, largely because a lot of white people and a lot of Christians see us as proto Christians, right? We're like exactly like Christians, except kind of stubborn on the Jesus thing. And so
Yeah.
when I, right, totally. And
Yeah.
so when I went to, I took a course, a post secondary course on cannabis cultivation. I wound up in a class as like a 50-year-old woman with like 7 boys who were like 22, and I was the very first Jew they had ever met in their entire lives. And yeah, it was
Surprise.
hilarious. Yeah, I mean, it was all love for each other, right? And we connected on some really interesting levels just because we all found ourselves in this course, right, on cannabis cultivation, meaning we all came from some trauma, right? We were all like, had an alternative way of looking at things, right? Like, we're all kind of outlaws in that sense.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
the very first week, every single person we studied, starting from Meshulam, was Jewish. So, like, by the third day, I was like,
Oh,
okay, do you
yeah.
guys know why every single person we're studying is Jewish? Like, no. And I was going to ask, I was like, thank God, but you're not allowed to answer that question. Meaning, like, it's really problematic. It's an important question why we played such an oversized role in the entire history of cannabis research and advocacy. At the same time, that if it's a question that non-Jews answer on their own without knowing that much, they'll just like the only answer that occurs to them from like discourse, stereotype, and implicit bias is that we like own the industry, right?
Right.
So what I found in this class was that these young kids like couldn't get enough of my like spontaneous mini Jewish lectures to explain our role in culture and to explain, for instance, the significance of the fact that it was a Holocaust survivor who discovered THC in the endocannabinoid system. So they loved all these mini lectures, but it also, I found out that they could really appreciate how and why Judaism was radically distinct from the Greco-Roman tradition, but also from the Christian tradition in a way they had never appreciated before, just by asking the question, why do Jews love weed? So then I realized this is actually a thing I could write about forever. Like it never, I could answer that question because I'm a Jew. That's what we do, right? It's like it could be interpreted this way and that way. It's like what we do in our actual midrash, in our actual, religious text, is debate things forever and ever. So then I realized in general, cannabis writing is pretty bad, right? And a lot of the cannabis, I don't like cannabis writing in most magazines because it reinforces an image that's not Jewish at all of like what cannabis is as a plant, right? Which is kind of reduced really to like medicine where you forget it's a plant or some like recreational thing. like your holistic notion that you want to talk about, like connecting with cannabis in terms of freedom and self-determination. And that's all in the Jewish tradition, right? So I realized to really explore why Jews love weed, you have to honor the role that cannabis has played in all of Jewish culture and history. And that I could write articles about the Jewish relation to cannabis and also promote companies, right, who contribute in a very Jewish way to the cannabis industry while helping to explain different cultural aspects of cannabis and really elevate it and give cannabis the writing she deserves, right? And remind everyone that this is, like, at the end of the day, a plant. And in the Jewish tradition, we have like serious responsibilities, right, to other living species, not in the Greco-Roman or the Christian, right? Which is why we have laws of kashrut, right? The kosher laws, which set limits, quite literally, to what we can do and how we can treat other species, all other species. And also remind us every single day that there is nothing that is alive that is outside of our sphere of moral concern. So writing about cannabis news from that perspective is really, really different and also necessary just to correct the exclusion of the Jewish relation to cannabis from mainstream cannabis culture, right? Because it really lacks that diversity. And they tell this whole story, even like focusing on Rastafari, right? Which is like all of their whole relation to cannabis is drawn from the Hebrew Bible, right? What Christians call the Old Testament. So like bringing that story in, and also it's like the market need and where it gets really functional, especially right now, is that we're all vulnerable to implicit bias, but it can prevent people who work in the industry from connecting with their Jewish clientele, right? Even when they want to. So like Cannabis U Magazine provides enough of the cultural background that corrects implicit bias and helps people to actually like appreciate like Jewish culture, like laugh at Jewish humor and like kind of understand it a little bit more and all of that. So that's sort of the role it's playing. But I really appreciate your support because it does get really deep when you think about what cannabis is from that Jewish historical perspective of the fact that like we have the genocidal arc of our history and the fact that we've relied on cannabis from the very beginning to like replenish our compromised endocannabinoid system because we all inherit pretty bad epigenetic luck, right? And cannabis we view as a gift from Hashem that quite in the most literal sense allows us to cope with our traumatic past, not forget it, just literally cope with it and not be like mean people all day, right? Cope with it and have just a little bit of optimism in the present, right? Because we have no cause for optimism based on our past, right? So we see it in this very holy sense, and it's talked about a lot, quite frequently in the Hebrew Bible, in terms of an oil or in terms of incense that was very regularly used in our ancient temple for the sake of spiritual communion with God. And even passages where Hashem is like, don't come near me without cannabisum, right? Because we get the word cannabis from cannabisum. So
Right.
for Hashem, it was like, he didn't want a bunch of cranky Jews coming near him and asking him for anything unless they had a little cannabisum, could chill out, relax their like, egocentric concerns and just approach the divine with like a little bit more wide perspective on things. But then in our Talmud, right, which is really just as old as our Hebrew, as the Hebrew Bible, it's our book of commentary about the Bible. There's an extensive discussion of cannabisum as medicine to treat
really?
very specific ailments. And my favorite one, which you're going to love as a woman who loves her freedom, is that they insist it's the best thing for women to take who are in labor to deal with the pain. Isn't that
I love
awesome?
that.
Amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, I do love that because there's such a huge growing network of pregnant women and mothers who use cannabisum, and they're using it successfully, and their children are healthy, and they're healthy, and fighting off all kinds of infections and la 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 la. Anyway, beautiful, beautiful that that's in the Talmud. Amazing to me.
Yeah, and that's why recovering all of this in mainstream cannabis culture helps significantly with detaching the bias for the very reason that you just
Right.
gave, right? Like,
Right.
this isn't Scientology. We're talking about like the oldest tradition in the world,
Right.
right? That's like recommending this as medicine for 3,000 years. It gives these women who are
And
being
not only that,
stigmatized. Yeah.
they've been doing it for thousands of years before it was ever written.
Right. Right. Exactly. Exactly. And so it gives people a whole other perspective, tradition, and worldview. Right. And the
Yes.
other thing that you're going to love this, I think, people who are anti-cannabis are definitely anti-Semitic. Like you actually can't separate them because people who are anti-Semitic or people who are anti-cannabis look at Jewish history, which is all about cannabis advocacy. And the only thing they can conclude is that we're like, drug addicts who can't be trusted, and like really irresponsible, right? So like sort of reinforces a lot of bias about Jews, right? So
Mhm.
I try to bring out that connection a lot, that if you're Jewish, you have to be pro cannabis and you have to be an advocate just so people don't have a negative reading of Jewish history itself. And if you're not an advocate, like you can't be anti cannabis as a Jew because it does encourage this very negative reading of Jews in general. Perhaps, like it was weird and controversial for everyone in the 60s when it was Jew after Jew after Jew, like making discoveries and being controversial, like Allen Ginsberg, for instance, right? Or like Bob Dylan, Everybody Must Get Stoned, right? Or
Yep.
Grinspoon, like Lester Grinspoon was the big one.
Yep.
And so after Lester Grinspoon published his book, Nixon was caught on tape saying out loud, "What the hell is wrong with the Jews, Bob? They're all into the marijuana. Maybe it's because they're all psychiatrists." Like that's hilarious and like really funny in terms of like documenting Jewish culture. So as soon as Nixon, like he was caught on tape, but at the same time, neo-Nazis started circulating their own theory to explain why Jews, like all Jews, love weed, right? Because it's across denominations. The biggest thing I tell non-Jews to really think about in terms of the bias is that the biggest consumers of cannabis in Jewish culture are the most religious Jews. So it's your Hasidic Jews and your Lubavitch Jews and the ultra Orthodox, like so pious and devout, right? That smoke weed all day long, right? So that's so different from any other traditions, not the renegades. It's like all of us, right? I just forgot what I was saying.
I want to ask you if you have ever heard of Rabbi Yaakov Cohen. I
Yeah,
met him. So I don't know if my audience knows this, but he travels around the world making sure that cannabis grows are kosher. And he was in Israel when I first got a hold of him, and we couldn't connect online. I didn't have the technology at that time to connect with him.
I'm so
I
glad
didn't
you
know how to
mentioned
do long
it.
distance Zoom at that time.
I have to say, I love him so much, and he is like a big reason I just love being a cannabis Jew, and that is what we call ourselves. I should mention it is an actual subculture that started in New York and is now very big in LA, and I'm trying to bring it to Canada, right? Because I'm actually American. I moved to Canada in 2019. So I
Oh,
love Rabbi Cohen so much. I wrote not one, but two articles that were really just transcribing an interview I had with him, just because we talked like Jews for so long about cannabis and what it means in the Jewish tradition, that it
oh,
warrants two articles. So you can read that at cannabisjew.com, because he spoke so philosophically, like he was giving a sermon about how cannabis is the greatest, most profound, beautiful gift that God has ever given us. And he's Orthodox. Let me
he
just say
is
that. He
so
is not a
delightful to talk
renegade. He's not a
to.
rebel. He's like as traditional as it gets. But to speak to your point about like women and Christianity, like I am a queer secular woman who identifies as being like of Lilith in terms of our tradition. Like I'm the Wicca crazy Jewish women who are like Miriam, right? Who was like, I've had enough, God, goodbye, right? Like the wild women, right? And I'm
Yes,
not at all like, so the fact that Rabbi Cohen basically spoke to me like I was a rabbi, and we bonded about cannabis and like expressed his like happiness to learn from me, because he didn't know all the
right.
endocannabinoid stuff. He didn't know like
Yeah,
a lot, like he's really focused at the time on just, is it kosher, is it not, right? So
yeah.
when I
Didn't know the
brought his
science.
concerns together with Jewish history and why Jews smoke all the time. He was like, I love it, but like really honored my knowledge, right? Like we were equals. And like cannabis has done that for me in terms of reconciling me to a lot of Jewish communities I would otherwise feel alienated from, right?
Honey,
So,
didn't that feel glorious coming from a man of his stature? Coming from a man at all to get kudos, but coming from a man of his
oh
stature
yeah, it
to
was
get kudos
incredible.
like
I mean,
that
I
and
was
to be treated
basically
like an equal.
crying.
Yeah,
Yeah, it was profound. And
powerful.
also just because when you have, like, I think we do, like, I feel like cannabis is my partner and I just feel so bound to her on like such a erotic level that makes
Hmm.
me feel like, am I crazy? But the rabbi really honored that feeling, right? By
Hmm.
sharing like stories from Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, right? Like yeah,
Ooh,
that spoke at length about the role of herbs on earth itself, like not just cannabis, but like, yeah, it's some trippy shit that like, yeah, some of it
yeah.
made it, yeah. So,
Oh, I love the depth that he brought into the conversation.
yeah, it was really, really cool. So I'm really glad that you mentioned him. And I just think he's a really good example. Like he's one of the first rabbis to devote his life to this as a form of tikkun olam, right? Which is the kind of the framework in which we understand what it means to be ethical in the Jewish tradition.
Tikkun alum. Is
Tikkun
that?
olam, it means to repair the world.
Oh, wow.
And the idea comes from reducing the amount of suffering in the world. I should say
Mm,
that. And it's a
mm.
concept that comes from Jewish mysticism. And Rabbi Cohen is an expert in Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism. And the idea is that,
Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism. I
mhm.
got to find out more about this. I don't know why it's just calling me, but it certainly
Oh, it's
Kabbalah.
amazing.
Okay.
Yeah, that's where a lot of feminist Jewish women, that's their source for like really trippy alternative, like Jewish herstory. Because it's not like when you read it kind of as sexist, except it's not. It's like they're portraying what's wrong with our tradition right there as men. Like the story of Lilith, for instance, is like unbelievable. Like it's not a cautionary tale, which I guess is how they mean it, but in the actual words they use, it inspires all of us to be like badass women who don't put up with anything. So it's a
Right.
really wild tradition. Yeah, so in the idea in terms of Jewish, so mysticism is an alternative. We don't read anything literally, right? And so, unlike Christians, no one who is Jewish reads our Bible literally. We have four or
This is my
five.
whole problem with
Yeah,
Christianity. They take that shit so literally, and it's just ridiculous blather in
honestly, that's part of
so
our,
many
you know,
places, most
our in
places.
group in our in group speak. We have the word goy, which is like the otherness of the others, non-Jews, and that is what we mean a lot by goy, like the literalness. Like how would you read? But for us, it's a violation of the ban against idolatry, right?
God,
Like
it
you're
should be a
not going to.
violation against humanity to read the Bible. And sorry, my opinion.
No, I love it. I love the tangent. It's very
Sorry.
Jewish of you. But I just want to honor what you're thinking and say, like, for Jews, just so you know, it doesn't make sense to be Christian and say you honor the ban against idolatry and then read your own work literally, since that's an image. And the whole point is you can't capture God or know God or see God in any image. Like, so Jews get that off the bat, which is why we have like four different kinds of interpretation, and they're all true, which is why like we don't even have like I don't even no one knows how to be a Jew because there are a million different interpretations of every law and they're all equally valid. It's hilarious to be a Jew. It truly is. But the Kabbalah, the mystical form of interpretation, gives a completely alternative account of the entire Hebrew Bible from what they say is like the hidden level of Torah. And that's where you get the alternative account of Genesis, for instance, that tells us, oh, Eve wasn't the first woman. Hell no, it was Lilith. Like it's fascinating stories, right? But the Kabbalistic theory of creation, like how the world was created, is very different than you get in the Hebrew Bible. And the theory in Kabbalah is that God exploded themselves. And so the world is basically the like result of the self-willed explosion of the divine essence. But in the course of the explosion, there were rips and tears, and God's essence did not perfectly get realized in the world. And so those you can feel the tears in the universe when we access one divine power in isolation of the others. So, for instance, if I judge someone, right, accessing the divine power of righteous judgment in isolation of love. So, if I judge someone without love, which is another divine attribute, I will definitely do something evil, right? So, evil is made possible by these sort of tears in the universe that produce sources of pain and suffering. And so Jews do not believe that we just sort of sit around waiting for some Messiah. It's actually literally up to us to create the conditions for the Messiah to come by doing whatever we can in the service of tikkun olam, which is to repair the world and repair the tears in the universe caused by the condition of the divine exploding themselves. And so you can see from this perspective that getting involved in the cannabis industry to increase access to an herb, literally a plant that significantly helps people cope and recover from their suffering, is for Rabbi Cohen like one of the most essential forms of tikkun olam we can be doing right now. So it was on that level that we really bonded, right? And that's the level in which you have this subculture called cannabis Jews. And you'll like this, it's a lot of secular Jews who are finding a way to reconnect with Jewish history and Jewish identity and feel Jewish pride about the history of Jewish cannabis use without feeling guilt that they don't go to synagogue or don't know their prayers or whatever. So that's what I'm also trying to build and honor, right? Because I really honor secular Jewish experience, because a lot of people forget we are an ethnic minority and a lot of people reduce us to a religion. But it's our ethnic side where we get all of our generational trauma, right? And so it makes sense that like thinking about cannabis use in terms of what Hashem provides for us to recover allows a lot of us to turn back to look at Hashem, to reconcile with the idea of a divine at all, right? Because lots of Jews are, really good atheists. Like we're good at that, right? Like at least it's a minority of Jews, I would still say, who are super religious, but it doesn't, it's not in conflict just because we're people with this like very intense history in our own culture, which is why we also have our own mannerisms, right? And our own way of appearing and our own habits, which under the white gaze, right, are often seen negatively and described as neurotic or pushy or talkative, which is actually what my new book is about that's coming out, and what the article is about that I just wrote about with empathy, right? It's like understanding that Jews are not white, right, but suffer acutely, all of us, from a very, very recent history of getting racialized and destroyed as racial imposters, right? It's just that the designation white Jews doesn't make sense at all. It like is an actual semantic paradox, because all it means to be white on the level of designation is that you don't have racial history, right? You've never been a member of a group that's been racialized as less than white. But if you're known to yourself as Ashkenazi Jewish, that is the ethnic Jewish group from Eastern Europe, you're known to yourself as an actual remnant of white supremacy, meaning the tiny group that survived, right?
Yeah.
So it confuses everyone. This is what my new book is about, like Jews and non-Jews, right? But it puts all of us in a position where we have to choose how to see Jews just to make sense of these people who are designated with this phrase that doesn't make sense. It's all kind of unconscious. And so a lot of people see white Jew and then sort of disavow the Jew part to see us as just white. But it can feel like a discovery they've made, like, oh, these people are actually just white. So then you get to this Kanye like conclusion, right? Well, we're not just white. We've been hiding something about who we are, and we're the whitest white of all people, right? Which is like a way that we're being seen right now by a lot of people, right? Who are like angry at all Jews, not just like the Netanyahu government or whatever. They're angry at all of us, right? For like occupying the role of white colonizers. Whereas in truth, we're a remnant because of colonialism, right? Like as Frantz Fanon said, he was a Black scholar who said like in the immediate aftermath of Nazism, that Nazism is what happened when colonialism exploded within the boundaries of Europe, and they didn't know what to do with the Jewish population who didn't fit into their neat categories required to build a new nation state system, right? Because so we were racialized as racial imposters. So my book is like, but other people conclude we're just Jewish and not white. And that's when you get to this like, and as a Jew, it's uncomfortable because we don't want to deny our designation and act as though we never pass as white, right? Or we don't sometimes have white privilege. And so my new book kind of explains all that and just recommends that we actually adopt a racial identity that marks our racial history as racial imposters and allows it to inherit it in a way it doesn't make us crazy. And so my suggestion is off-white, right? Right. So you can see if we're off-white, we can pass as white, some of us sometimes until we don't, right? But we don't have the same experience of the world as white people simply because we are actually an ethnic minority and are seen by white people like the way people see Larry David, right? As like kind of inappropriate, crazy, weird, neurotic. Whereas when I watch Curb Your Enthusiasm, that guy's my hero. I think he's right about everything, right? So like, I think Curb Your Enthusiasm is like a long Jewish joke, right? About how
Yeah.
white people see us, and
Yeah.
that if white people decide we're white, they will never think we're appropriate for their spaces, right? It's like, so yeah, that's kind of like how my interest in the cannabis industry and creating diversity and helping to counter bias is very much related to the work I've always been doing. And it's really focused on educational outreach in the cannabis sector.
What's the name of your book?
The book that's forthcoming is just called White/Jew.
Okay, forthcoming. I'm right there with you, sister, and in a painful process of getting it proofed and edited by other medical people and all that jazz, on my end for
Oh,
my
Mazel tov.
manuscript. Thank you. Same to you.
I'm so happy for you. That is awesome.
Girl, it is. It's been through a couple of doctors and scientists already, and it came through without bursting into flames. So I was really tickled. And I haven't pushed the publish button yet, but I'm close, And so
So the fact that you did your own peer review, yeah, it's extraordinary. Like, I don't know if this sounds weird, but I'm really proud of you. You really honor women. You really show me what we can do. Like, I'm so happy to hear that. And like, I do think women are transforming the cannabis industry. I do think women are so much more connected to the significance of cannabis as a plant and how our relation to cannabis is very, very connected to the way we pursue self-care.
Right.
And I guess I want to pause and say you have so much reason to feel so proud, but that can be hard for us as women too, to just take a minute, appreciate that, right? Really feel joy in accomplishing your own goals and like how hard the world makes that for us and how much you had to overcome, like an unbelievable amount to be able to even do that. Yeah, that nobody else
true.
really appreciate. Yeah.
But writing, and probably for any project, just when you start seeing the light at the end of the tunnel and coming to the end of it, knowing that you're going to do it and it's happening. God, that's an exhilarating feeling.
It's great.
Exhilarating. And so I love where you are with this. I love the herstory of all of this is just so precious. It's so rich, especially in Judaism and cannabis. Cannabis has such a beautiful, rich history.
Well, I don't know if you've heard of the TV show Broad City.
Say it again. The what?
Broad City is a TV show. It's no longer on air, but it was broadcast by Comedy Central. It's the first cannabis comedy featuring East Coast Jewish women from New York as like pot slackers or whatever. It is so funny. It's one of the most Jewish shows. It is like some of the best Jewish humor I've ever seen in my life. But it's like, it speaks to everything you were just saying, but really shows that like the relation of Jewish women to cannabis is so distinct that what they did by creating Broad City was like something that's never been done before. It was like years of like a high times, right? But from like
Yeah.
a Jewish woman's perspective, because like I'm sure you know Jewish women, we are like so driven and so queer. And the reason why we have an epithet called shiksa, right, which we just use in group, it literally is the most narrow, it's so hilarious as an insult. It only designates tall, thin, blonde, non-Jewish women. Like that's it. It's like, why do we have that, right? It's because like for a lot of reasons, none of us can actually aspire to that. We don't even want to. Like the whole passive, delicate ideal, it's not in Jewish culture. Right? I've never met a passive Jewish woman in my life. And so just the fact that Jewish women are so driven and so brilliant puts us in a weird category, right? And we're seen as privileged, even though we're not. And we are subject to a lot of violence, both inside our communities and out. That's hard for people to hear about. So a lot of us just like to smoke weed with each other, and we don't need anybody else ever in the whole world. And that is what Broad City is about. That is what the show Broad City is about. It's about two Jewish women who get high just by themselves every day and talk about how they don't need anyone else in the world to be happy. Like it is
Oh, I love it.
so fun and so cute. Yeah, I can't recommend it enough.
Hey, this is Yaya and Honey. I'm getting ready for the Women's Spirit Retreat, and I just wanted to tell you, it's July 18th through 20th. You can register and come for free. It's online, and there's going to be some brilliant women giving us fabulous tools to fill up our little hearts. Come join us at the Women's Spirit Retreat online, July 18th through 20th. It's totally free. And you know what I'm going to be talking about? The spirit of cannabis. Come join us.
Wow. Well, this is a whole new side of cannabis that a lot of people had no idea about it, had no idea that it was even a thought, a concern, an avenue, an angle, anything. Cannabis Jew. And there's a magazine about it. What? And
Yeah.
oh, by the way, it's Cannabis Jew. Is it cannabisjewmagazine.com?
It's cannabisjew.com.
Cannabisjew.com. Say it. Cannabisjew.com. Yeah. So, and I'll have links in the show notes and to did you say Broad Girl?
Oh, Broad City.
Broad City. That's the name of the show. Yeah. I'm going to look that up and get some links to it. See if I can't find some cute entertainment.
Yeah. And it's like interesting that people don't know at all about this history, just because you would think in the industry all knew of Dr. Raphael Mechoulam, right? Who literally discovered THC in the endocannabinoid system, right? But
right.
A lot of people don't think about that. And then if you just put the dots together, it's all these Jews. And so from a Jewish perspective, the cannabis industry was really founded by Israeli ingenuity, tikkun olam, and a desire to heal from the Holocaust, right? Because you have a nation founded, right, by Holocaust survivors. And so even though it's a new perspective, it's actually for me just like correcting the exclusion of Jewish history, which has played such a prominent role in mainstream cannabis culture. And I know this is like biased, but it's hilarious. And I think you'll agree. I honestly think some of the like stuff we hate about the cannabis industry, right? Like the lingering misogyny and all of that. I think it's because we've excluded like the Jewish relation to this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The language is horrific as well. And the misogyny in the cannabis language is just unforgivable. Unforgivable. I go to I call them candy stores, dispensary here in Michigan, because we had over 400,000 medical patients using cannabis before recreation came in, and then it just wiped them out. We're down to 30,000 now.
Yeah.
And there's no education to help these patients who are all on a handful of polypharmacy, and none of them know if anything is going to contraindicate with anything else. And they don't know that they can tame THC, and they don't know how to microdose, and they don't know how to pick their terpenes, and they don't know how to choose, percentages in compounds or what the fuck of anything. And
Well,
the dispensary candy stores don't teach them either, because their 12-year-old bud tenders don't know a fucking thing.
yeah,
So
it's also
yeah,
why,
I'm
despite like,
disgusted with it.
yeah, well, despite what's happening, like despite the universal hatred of like Israel right now, Israel, and I'm curious what you think about this. Actually,
Sorry.
Israel actually provides an incredible model for thinking about where we could go with cannabis in terms
Yeah.
of like how it's dispensed and like our understanding of it. Because
Well, but
Israel,
you still can't smoke pot in Israel.
well, this is where it's interesting, and this is where it's interesting to talk about is that uh, cannabis is fully integrated into the Israeli medical system, right? There's
Right.
a separate
Yes. If you're a patient, you got
cannabis
it made.
completely. Now they have, it's going to change very soon, but up until now, they haven't made what they call recreational legal, but they have decriminalized it, right? And so,
Oh, that's
there aren't like punitive, there's not a punitive response to people smoking. There used to be, right? But not
mhm.
anymore.
Uh-huh.
But what I like about it, I think that they should decriminalize recreational even more. But despite like the problems it's led to, just their single-minded focus on this is medicine. This is medicine. We're talking about medicine that's essential for trauma. I think is really necessary to correct that bias, right? Like, and a model for us to follow as a nation, right? And I'm sure you can imagine that in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, they've added like at least 6,000, probably more, but at least 6,000 people to their registry, right, of people who are prescribed medical cannabis
Yeah.
legally. So
Mhm.
I wish we could like pay attention to that part of the story in terms of like October 7th, because we could learn a lot from it, but we're not, right? Because because people are just drawing, have a lot of misinformation, right? Which I'm trying hard to correct.
It's tough. The myth and stigma of cannabis persists, but it will not prevail, because science and women in particular are going to make certain that cannabis rises back to its full potential, to heal the world, to heal the world,
Yeah,
not just
do you know why I think
a few
it's
of us.
connected like women's freedom too, and like women's spirituality? Like she is a queer bitch. Like that's how I just that's so am I, right? Like I'm a queer woman. Cannabis is a queer woman, and in a lot of traditions, like the Christian tradition, there's like an inherent suspicion of nature that gets articulated in terms of suspicion towards women and a desire to control women the way that we control nature. And that's all explained in the tradition of ecofeminism that I really appreciate, right? Which draws a
Mm.
correlation between how we treat the earth, how we treat anything living, right? Like plants, insects, anything. Um, and how we like treat ourselves, and also like just systemic uh violence against women, right? That like
Yeah.
it is very easy for men, this is the thinking, and I agree, it's very easy for men to like reduce the autonomy or take control over women when they think nothing of doing that to plant animal life, right? So
I was going to say that earlier when you were talking about how they connect the way they think about women to lack of empathy. We do the same thing with our food. We give no thought to killing cattle and pigs and sheep and calves and chickens. We train ourselves not to think about that.
yeah,
Unfortunately,
so I
yeah.
do women who are transforming the cannabis industry. There are so many Jewish women at the forefront of research that is astounding. Yeah, and I think part of what we need to do, it's like the guys in charge are still all the rich guys who are in the industry to make money. But I like meeting women like you, right? Because we start our own businesses
Yeah,
and get by. And it's not about making money. It's about like keeping it real and honoring cannabis and tikkun olam, right? And
yes.
so like I just, it's helped me break from patriarchy too, just being in the cannabis industry, in terms of like, and maybe you feel
I'm
this way too.
right.
I don't measure my success by anything these guys say anymore. I don't care, right? I just feel so
Yeah,
lucky and honored to be doing work that feels like
sacred.
so sacred. Yes, exactly. And in
Yeah,
every way, and you know, helps me identify with my own identity and tradition, right?
yeah.
Yeah, it's just really
And your
great.
own life practice. Your own
Yeah.
life practice. My life practice has become living the way I think I ought to, want to, need to be in this world, to live in peace, to live in safety, to live in confidence that I will be taken care of or that I can take care of myself, you know,
Well, that's
autonomy. And
like
yeah.
what I found was the connection between starting to grow cannabis and recovering from trauma in a more profound way. Because
Mm.
after my father died, you'll love this story. My father's deathbed curse to me was that I was a failure. Oh, it's biblical. This is some biblical Jewish dysfunction. He actually said the same thing that Joseph said to Reuben in the Bible on his deathbed, which is hilarious. It's funny from a Jewish dark, humor, but it's funny. He was like, told me like anything I do, I'll be a failure. And he said I was a failure as a human being, right? And so that's intense to hear from your dad on his deathbed, right? And so it did like kick in a different set of symptoms, because I've had post-traumatic stress disorder my whole life, like a lot of Jews, right? Like not only do we inherit epigenetic luck that compromises our endocannabinoid system, but we suffer from generational trauma in our homes, right? And so much abandonment because of very bad Holocaust histories. Um, and so a lot of us have what's called developmental or complex trauma. So it
Yeah.
affects us on the level of like our central nervous system. And so after my father said that, new symptoms I'd never ever had before, like waking up in a silent scream, that actually became disabling. Like I couldn't, and this is why people with
Mm.
PTSD socially isolate. Like I couldn't actually. It was like I was Larry David, but times 100 wherever I went. Like I couldn't be in public. I was just too cranky and angry and crying all the time, right?
Oh,
But growing cannabis was life changing, changed my
yeah,
whole life,
yeah.
because connecting to cannabis as a plant, and like me, she's queer. You, she may decide to hermaphrodite herself. Like you can't control or know this plant.
Yeah, I'm not sure my audience understand. All my audience might understand what you're saying,
But
but
the reproductive technology of cannabis is not heterosexual, meaning there are options with reproduction that are so we just have to say they're queer, right? And like,
right, because it's both male. The cannabis plant is both male and female, and depending on how you grow it, it will be one or the other, or it could be.
well, cannabis that grows cannabis that people use to grow cannabis is always female, always. But it's possible to grow a cannabis plant that becomes hermaphroditic and then can like grow more cannabis without like being fertilized, right? So like
Yes,
it is some
it can
is
fertilize
wild.
itself.
Yeah, it's like so that, but also like when you I guess I just like connected with it on this level. Like I had to learn to both respect the limits of cannabis, because she really doesn't, she needs soil and community, and she needs to be left alone a lot and respected. But I could also figure out how to take care of myself, and
Hmm.
like, what I was willing to do for cannabis to attend to her, help me
Hmm.
better accept and take seriously what I needed to do to attend to myself.
Hmm.
Because people with PTSD often don't do great self-care. Like we're not great with exercising or like honoring our
Oh yeah.
needs. Like always stressed. That's why Jewish women are like so hyper productive. It's like we're always trying to survive the next Holocaust better, right? Like get more
Mm.
credentials. Like we're
Oh.
all really anxious about success so much, right? That's part of why my dad said that, right? Like I just grew up in an environment where someone was winning and someone was losing every day. And there was like a determination and a measurement to decide who every day. It was like unbearable, right? But again, all of that is like Holocaust trauma.
Mm.
Uh so yeah, I think that growing it,
I'm sorry,
connecting
I
with
want to make a point here, and I'm not sure if it's correct, so you let me know. Isn't Holocaust trauma genetic now?
Yeah, it's called epigenetics. So we used
Yeah.
to believe that genetic transmission was not at all affected by cultural factors. So
But it
like
is.
we thought it was hardwired. But what we found is that when people go through genocide, and that means like if someone survived and like different modes of survival, right?
Yeah.
But if people go through genocide, that affects your genetic transmission in terms of heightening the possibility, like being more vulnerable to developing certain conditions. But it also like changes what's called like the economy of the endocannabinoid system, which means that you literally don't have the same amount or distribution of endocannabinoids that your like body produces naturally to help you significantly to chill out, right? And to forget. Like a really big part of like cannabinoid therapy in terms of like why our body produces cannabinoids is to help us forget the past, like just move on and not like, focus on it. So epigenetic
And you're
transmission,
talking about something like anandamide
yeah, right. So like
to help us feel better and to help us heal and feel good. Our
exactly. And
body produces cannabinoids like anandamide that
yeah,
help us feel better. Right.
right. And what Michelin discovered about the endocannabinoid system, its entire function is to sustain homeostasis for every other system.
Yeah.
And it does
Master
that
regulatory.
exclusively through, cannabinoids. So, yeah, what was I just saying? All right, so trauma, right? So there's this on that epigenetic level, we're just more susceptible to getting PTSD from a situation of violence, but we're also born like with a deficiency in the cannabinoids that allow other people to like wake up and feel excited about the day, right? Like I have a
Yeah.
phrase called cranky Ashkenazi, right? And I'm like, yeah, we're all cranky because Ashkenazis are the ethnic group that were targeted, specifically targeted for annihilation, right? So I'm like, we're all Larry David, but like I need people to understand where the cranky Ashkenazi comes from. It's not because we're assholes, it's because we just don't wake up that way. We're not white people. We're not like, oh, I wonder what today is gonna bring. We're like, yeah, right? Like, so weed helps us like overcome that. But the other reason why we suffer from generational trauma, and this is more culture and not like on the level of genetics, is just the fact that we're a remnant means that our very close ancestors, like our grandparents and our great grandparents, did things in order to survive that they themselves could not live with. So
Yeah.
no one who has survived genocide does so by keeping their morality intact. And one reason I don't think that we can process the Holocaust at all is because we don't talk about the stories that we
Well,
can't
we're forbidden
live
to.
with. Yeah,
Yeah.
but you can imagine. I'll give you the one that like sears me, and I need people to know when they meet like a Jewish mother who's like narcissistic and kind of frightening, like where that trauma comes from. And so this other sense, I should just say, of generational trauma is that our ancestors compromised themselves to survive the Holocaust, and they were in no position at all to have children because they had just lost their own children in gas chambers.
Why would they want to
right?
have more?
And
Yeah.
well, because there were none of us left, right? Like
But to populate the kingdom, of
well, that,
course.
but also to cope, right? It's a trauma response. Sex is an amazing trauma response. So, like, I know it seems weird, but like,
and around death, sex is very urgent in people.
yeah. So
that's a thing. When somebody close to you dies, you want to go fuck somebody else. It's weird,
but think about it this way: you have survivors that all meet together.
Appropriation.
This place persons camp called a DP camp. So I met so growing up, I had teachers because I went to a Jewish day school who would identify as I'm a child of a DP camp, right? It's like, it is the worst possible condition into which to actually bring a child into. I understand why they did it as a trauma response, but it's inevitable that there will be a cycle of generational abandonment, emotional abandonment, that will also like in some way mark the survival mechanism that enable you to be here. So for instance, if women got to a concentration camp, like a death camp, unlike men who like there was a selection and there's like a third of men maybe were chosen for labor and like could maybe survive. like 2/3 of women, if not more, were immediately chosen for the gas chamber because they showed up with children. So the only way that a woman could at all survive, again, this is why we are here, is because one of your foremothers, right, like pretty recently, just made the decision to ditch her children to like the most horrifying death by themselves in a gas chamber, pretend she didn't have children, and survive. So you can imagine the way that kind of abandonment plays itself out on a generational level to really pathological behavior of Jewish mothers who act in ways that are so emotionally abusive that they literally disable their daughter's sense of agency and ability to like do anything in the world. But then they'll do something like give her money and say, I saved you. I've been saving you my whole life. Right. That allows, it's like
Alyssa.
literally a repetition of trauma. Right. It's like an abandonment, but they get to say they didn't abandon. It's like, so it's so hard to describe this to non-Jews. Right.
And I feel traumatized just, I guess, because I understand what you just said, but it's horrifying. The realization is horrifying that a mother would have to choose between her own life and her kids just to survive and just to help the survival of the race. And
Yeah.
then
And then,
live
yeah.
with that. And then
Yeah.
live with that. It's
Yeah. Yeah.
horrifying. It curdled my blood to hear it, and does so right now just thinking about it.
But
It
you can see,
curdles my blood.
thank you so much. I appreciate that. And you can see that when my dad died, I had to figure out all this out, right? It's like
Oh,
Jewish women are also, now you can see why this drives us crazy. We're all
yeah,
seen visually as like privileged.
yeah,
And how, like, if they knew that we suffered the most severe emotional abuse growing up, like they would
yeah,
just not get it, right? But like
right.
cannabis was critical for me
Oh
to
my God,
find
I
a
get
way
it.
to recover that history and understand that what happened to me as a child was not my fault. But I
Right.
couldn't have recovered that without cannabis. There's no way. And that's also why I think it makes sense that it's provided by Hashem, right? So that we can like make peace with our history and not hate like our ancestors, right? And like find a way to inherit our Jewish culture without repeating all of that
Yeah,
trauma. Right?
yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's going to happen through the women, like you said.
Yeah. And cannabis, I think
And
so.
cannabis.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you. I do. So the lesson that I'm hearing in this discussion is to have courage, women. And as um, one of my favorite sayings is Latin, it's age quod agis. It means put one foot in front of the other and just keep going, baby. Just
Yeah.
keep on your mission. And God, what an incredible mission and what an incredible story. How can we find your publication? Is it an online publication?
Yep. So
Magazine?
cannabisjew.com, Cannabis Jew magazine. I do want to give you the Jewish equivalent to what you just said because I think you're going to love it.
Tell me.
Our equivalent to that Latin phrase is "this too shall pass."
Yes.
All right, it'll
Yes.
pass. It's fine. Which I way prefer to like the sort of the Christian idea of everything happens for a reason, because that was like
Yeah.
kind of a mean thing to say to someone suffering trauma, right? It's like
Yeah.
I don't want someone, signifying my excessive pain in some positive way that's meant to occur. I much prefer, like, again, as you're saying, drawing on like women's strength and our resilience and just
Yeah.
reminding myself I can save myself, as Jewish women have always done and continue to do. So I love that.
Yeah.
So cannabisjew.com is the publication, and we build Jewish community and solidarity and support for Israel in the cannabis sector through content, promotion, and educational outreach materials. And my book, White/Jew, is forthcoming next year from Indiana University Press.
I can't wait for that one. That's going to be a real education for white women, ain't it?
Yeah, it is. I'm super excited.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, and all of the examples, all of them are from popular culture and from scandals about Jews. And my analysis helps us to reread these scandals in completely different ways, most of them involving Jewish women. So I think you're really going to love it.
I'm sure I am. And once you come back, when you hit that publish button and remind us that we want to buy it and read it and get into
I
it,
will. Thank you
change
so
our
much.
own attitudes, right?
Yep, absolutely will, I think.
All
Thank you
right.
so much.
Listen, it's been such a pleasure to listen to you. It's so moving to begin to understand the journey of the Jewish woman in herstory and cannabis too. And
Yeah,
so
I appreciate that so much. It really means the
love
world to me.
ha-
Well, thank you.
love having you here. Won't you come back, please?
I will. It was a blast. I loved it. It was
Okay,
great.
great. I'll let you know when this is going to air. I'll send you the link and we'll do a little, some promo media around the socials and blah, blah, blah. And we'll be in touch. Thank you so much for your wisdom and your courage, darling.
Oh, thank you. And thank you, honey, for your solidarity. I really appreciate it. And for the love. Thank you so much. And for seeing us. Thank you so much.
Oh, I love it, love it, love it. Talk to you again soon.
All
Bye,
right,
honey.
sounds good. Bye, honey.
You've been listening to another Cannabis Truth podcast with 21st century cannabis shaman Honey Smith Walls. It is important to use verifiably safe products and look out for yourself while we're in this wild, wild west of cannabis right now. Ask for help. It can get complicated. If you need serious medical attention, please consult one of the specialists at cannabisclinicians.org. They will get you to the right person and therapy for your issues. Tune in here for weekly foundational knowledge and learn to determine the best choices and cannabis strategies for your issues. But please be advised that shamans are not doctors or scientists. You'll find those at cannabisclinicians.org. Unless otherwise proven by a reputable third-party lab test, please regard all street weed as contaminated. It may do grave harm to a patient with a delicate immune system who already has inflammatory issues like arthritis, IBS, fibromyalgia, or worse. Thank you for your time today.